I thought I'd talk today about some organizations in which I've been involved for the last number of years, which have really, I think, led the way in understanding ecosystem science, ecosystem carbon cycling, and these are the Fluxnet-Canada and the Canadian Carbon Program Research Networks, which existed from 2001 until last year. Regretfully, they've come to an end, but I was privileged to serve on the science and the executive committees of these organizations, and it gave me a lot of insight into the work that's going on across the country, trying to understand key issues around the carbon cycle in Canada's boreal forest and peatlands. So first of all, a brief review. What is, or was, properly speaking, I guess, the Fluxnet-Canada and the Canadian Carbon Program? It was inaugurated in actually 2002. The big funding proposal went in 2001, and it was formally inaugurated, funded starting in 2002, primarily from the Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Sciences, which again, regretfully, is no longer in existence, to study and understand the carbon cycle of Canada's forests and peatlands. There's a big deal about including peatlands in here as well. So again, the goal of the organization was to furnish critical carbon cycle measurements necessary to develop and test process models that describe and predict how our ecosystem respond to changes in climate and ecological disturbances. That was another issue that was very central to the mission, I guess, of SCRN and CCP. Now, I'm not really involved that much in the measurements, although I'll be reporting a lot about the measurements made by other people. My particular involvement at the basis in which I was asked to join the science and the executive committees actually comes around the process modeling, and we'll get into that a little bit as to how these modelers are used to understand ecosystem behavior. The first 5 years we were known as Fluxnet, the Fluxnet-Canada Research Network. This work was continued and expanded in the Canadian Carbon Program from 2007 until pretty much the present. And during this period, we provided a demic, and it was a very collaborative environment. I think it's one of the more successful indications that scientists can, in fact, work together productively. And we actually all enjoyed a very collegial relationship with, again, scientists, about 50 scientists. There are 50 scientists from research universities and from different branches of the federal government for the project. And in the course of these times, there were about 120 graduate students, and I should add postdocs, that conducted research on a diverse set of topics. The rationale is that the movement of CO2 back and forth between terrestrial ecosystems, the atmosphere, is about more than 10 times our industrial production of CO2. Now, when we first started giving these talks at the inception of these networks, the figure we used was 15 or 16 times. However, it's not that the fluxes from the forests are getting smaller, the industrial fluxes are getting larger, so the current value we use is more than 10, but it's no longer 15 as it was when we got started about 10 years ago. So nonetheless, the point is that relatively small changes in the balance of these fluxes could have a very large effect on our overall national carbon budget, and so we wanted to understand the mechanisms for these changes because of the feedbacks that are involved on atmospheric CO2 and consequently on climate change. Now, there's good evidence that terrestrial ecosystems sequester on average about 30% of our fossil fuel emissions each year that would otherwise remain in the atmosphere. However, that sink source status is very vulnerable. It's subject to change. It can change rapidly with disturbance. It can also change with climate. Therefore, this continued ecosystem service of 30% removal is not one on which we can rely indefinitely to continue. Forests could significantly play a significant role in carbon mitigation, but again, the sequestration processes need to be better understood to understand what that role is going to be in the future as climates evolve. Climate change will have an impact on the capacity of terrestrial ecosystems, so we need to understand the sensitivity of ecosystems to changing climate. So climate change projections are a big part. I'll get to some of those later. And given the importance of climate change to our society economy, We need to improve our capacity to integrate all available information about the carbon cycle. So our key focus here is on Canada's forests and peatlands, which occupy a huge swath of our national lands and therefore have a very large effect on our national carbon balance. In part of this network, a series of flux stations, we'll talk about these fluxes in just a moment, a series of flux stations based on Eddy covariance measurements was established in a transect across the country from BC through Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and then out to eastern Canada. There were a number of associated towers which were brought into the network, but which were funded externally. Those are indicated by the yellow dots. Two of these are peatlands, the western peatland and the eastern peatland. I'll be talking about those. The one on the west coast is a coastal temporal forest. The ones in the interior are continental forest. There's actually a nest of towers in here for both deciduous as well as coniferous forest. This is a mixed wood. This one down here is a planted white pine plant. It's a white pine plantation. This is a black spruce, and that's balsam fir. So, again, they represented the different forest types that exist in these different parts of the country. At some of these sites, chronosequences were established. In other words, towers mounted over forests that had been disturbed at differing periods in the past in order to try to follow the time course of the forest carbon cycling as it regenerates following stand replacing disturbances. There were transects here at the BC site. There was a post-harvest chronosequence here, post-harvest and post-fire here, and a post-harvest chronosequence over there. So it was quite a large operation. The Eddy covariance technique, I'll just review that really briefly. The Eddy covariance technique relies on the fact that during the day at least, as forests absorb radiation and warm up and exchange energy with the atmosphere, they will generate warm CO2-depleted air within the forest canopy, and that this will mix, due to turbulence generated by wind, with cooler air, but that's CO2 richer, that has a higher CO2 concentration in the atmosphere above. And with turbulence generated by wind speed, there's an exchange such that if you mount a sonic anemometer at some height above the forest, usually about 5 to 10 meters, and you measure the vertical wind speed plotted here, you'll measure periods during which CO2 rises. That's represented as a positive value on this axis. You'll find periods when the wind flux is down. That's a negative value. So negative values are downdrafts. Positive values are updrafts. And if you measure the temperature of the air and also the water vapor concentration of the air at the same time, as well as the CO2 concentration, if you measure the water vapor got left out for some reason, but if you measure the temperature, the water vapor, and the CO2 concurrently with the vertical wind speed, and you correlate the changes in temperature. For example, with this updraft here, the temperature goes up because the forest is warmer, but the CO2 concentration goes down. Similarly, if you get a downdraft of air occurring, you find here there's a downdraft. You find the temperature goes down because the air aloft is cooler, but the CO2 concentration is higher. If over time you integrate the product of the wind speeds times the CO2 concentration or the temperature or the water vapor concentration, if you integrate those concentrations with the wind speed over time and average and add up, if you simply add up the products of the updrafts and their concentrations, the downdrafts and their concentrations, the total that you get represents a flux which is typically aggregated over a half-hour period of time. It's a net flux. It's a net flux of CO2. It's a net flux of heat called the sensible flux, or a net flux of water vapor called the latent heat flux. That's the energy equivalent. And those terms then are then the key output products of the Eddy covariance tower. We'll be looking at mostly at CO2 fluxes simply because we have to draw some boundaries around our subject here. Most of us probably want to be out of here well before 2 o'clock. So I'll focus on the CO2. How do we interpret these results? How do we analyze? How do we attribute cause and effect to changes in CO2 balances of ecosystems? We do that using mathematical models in which we represent the fundamental physical, biological, micrometeorological processes that drive carbon, water, and nutrient cyclings in forests. What are those processes? To summarize them very briefly, it's energy exchange with the atmosphere. It is gas exchange with the atmosphere, and I should also mention energy and gas exchange propagated through the soil through a multi-layered canopy and soil system. So the exchange with the atmosphere, but the propagation of those fluxes through the soil is also very important. Transfers of water, of course, exchanges of water with the atmosphere, transfers of water through the soil. Transfers of nitrogen, remembering that all carbon fluxes are coupled with those of nitrogen. Carbon does not move unless nitrogen moves, so you've got to have a complete treat of nitrogen, and I should add phosphorus. Phosphorus is also a key limiting element, so the coupling with the phosphorus, the biochemistry, and the chemistry and biochemistry of phosphorus and nitrogen have to be fully represented in the multi-layered soil profile because its uptake is coupled to the exchange of CO2. And of course, last and definitely not least, the carbon cycle, the exchange with the canopy, the exchange with the soil, the movement of carbon through the soil, and again representing both dominant populations, subdominant populations, surface litter layers, the soil surface and soil layers, and all the various complex biological communities that inhabit those different layers. So it gets a little bit involved, but the challenge then of comparing, for example, energy exchange or carbon exchange with those measured by the Eddy covariance tower is does our understanding of the key processes by which those fluxes control, is that understanding corroborated by the measurements we record under these site-specific conditions at the different tower fluxes? And if so, how can we attribute changes in CO2 fluxes to changes in the underlying processes as driven by, for example, changes in climate, changes in disturbance? The key questions, I'll go through some of these key questions today, but the key questions that were developed in the course of the formulation of our research networks are sort of listed here. I'll try to go through some of those questions in turn and give, in a sense, a summary of the findings in the research network that represents our best understanding of the answers to these questions, such as they've been developed so far. And again, you know, there's obviously further that we can go, but funding is never indefinite, so that we're more or less left at this stage with the answers that we have, and further resolution to the answers and to the questions that they themselves engender will have to await future developments. All right, first of all, how do the carbon cycles of Canada's forests differ, or how do they differ across Canada? And here's a big question. Are mature forests in Canada carbon sinks? This really addresses this issue. Should we retain mature forests as a means of continuing the sequestration of carbon in our forests, or on the assumption that these forests are not carbon sinks, should we get rid of them, replace them with younger forests which are stronger carbon sinks, sort of in the way that old professors are retired and new professors brought in their place in order to sustain the productivity of the department? And you may well come to a decision in that regard after having listened to the rest of my presentation. What we've done here then is we've taken the annual aggregated exchange of CO2. That upper graph there represents the annual integrated exchange of CO2, the annual aggregated exchange of CO2 for a number of different sites at those flux towers that I showed on the earlier map across the continent. These represent different forest types, of course, and so plotting them all on the same graph, I don't know how scientifically valid that is, but it's the kind of synthesis diagram that people like to see. So there it is. They're all plotted on the same graph. A positive value represents net carbon uptake. A negative value represents net carbon loss. The values are in megagrams carbon per hectare per year, and again representing the aggregated CO2 flux measured for different years at the different flux towers. On the bottom axis here is the time since last stand replacing disturbance, effectively the forest age. And of course what you can see is that although the forests are carbon sources early in their life cycle, from about 30 to 50 years, 30 to 60 years, they can be fairly substantial carbon sinks. So during their most productive years, again, the reference to professors keeps coming back, but during their most productive years, they can have fairly substantial rates of net carbon uptake. These are rates of net carbon sequestration in megagrams per hectare per year. However, as they get older, that productivity does tend to go down, although they do remain sinks, but small sinks. They do remain small sinks. Now, this graph here, and it's not my graph, it's actually published agricultural and forest meteorology. This graph here is a little bit skewed by the fact that the more productive stands haven't reached the very mature age required for them to be represented as mature forests in this graph. The very mature forests we see here are generally very low productivity spruce forest. So I'm concerned that this graph may skew toward lower values for mature forest. But some of the more productive stands, for example, the Douglas fir, is one of, or the white pine plantation. These two here are highly productive, but they're only present in this graph at ages up to about 50 or 60 years. So we don't really see how they do in the much longer term. So, small sinks is the answer. We also have plotted these next graphs here, gross ecosystem productivity. It's possible to disaggregate CO2 exchange into that which is it represents photosynthetic fixation and that which represents ecosystem respiration. And you can see the time courses here and here. You can see that these very large sources very early in the growth cycle of forest is largely attributed to a very low rate of photosynthetic fixation, a very low gross ecosystem productivity, accompanied by low but not low enough values of ecosystem respiration. A lot of this early ecosystem respiration is driven by the coarse woody debris that remains behind after a disturbance event. And it takes quite a while for the regenerating forest to develop a gross ecosystem productivity that can offset the emissions arising from the decomposition of the coarse woody debris. Okay, continuing on, what happens to the carbon cycle of the forest after it's harvested? One of the sites, you can see I washed it out here so it wouldn't interfere too much with the text, but you can see it kind of faded in the background. One of the sites, this is a coastal Douglas fir plantation in BC, which was harvested in 2002, and over which a flux tower was mounted to monitor the exchange of CO2 as the forest regenerated following the clear cut. You can see in this picture here the very large amount of coarse woody debris that's left behind, and that stuff is going to respire. It's going to return a lot of CO2 to the atmosphere over the many years of its during which it decomposes. A summary of the findings from these sites is that following harvest, we have three forests here: black spruce, the Douglas fir that you see pictured in the background, and jack pine. These are two continental, these are two boreal conifers, and this is a temperate conifer. You can see that there's been a substantial decline in gross ecosystem productivity over the several years following disturbance. You can also see a decline here in ecosystem respiration, but the decline in respiration in relative terms is much less than that in gross ecosystem productivity, as a consequence of which the net ecosystem productivity, while being slightly positive before harvest, becomes negative after harvest. So the forest goes from being a small sink of CO2 to being a much larger source of CO2 during the years following harvest. For Douglas fir, because it's a more productive forest, the numbers are larger. It's a fairly substantial sink before harvest. The forest at this site, I think, was about 60 or 80 years old. It was in that range there, getting on a little bit, but it's still extremely productive. After harvest, it becomes a very strong sink. Why? Because there's so much more coarse woody debris left behind after you harvest a forest of this productivity. You can see in the background, this is an extremely productive forest region, and it's very heavily used for lumber. The jack pine, again, a very small sink. As you saw in the previous graph, a very small sink, but a much larger source following harvest. What do we learn from this? We learned that harvest stands continue to lose carbon until the uptake of carbon by new growth matches ecosystem respiration, as we showed with those scatter diagrams in the previous graph. This tends to occur at approximately 10, 17, and 10 years of age. Again, this is in a continental black spruce or a boreal black spruce, a temperate conifer, and a boreal jack pine, respectively. By this time, the stands will have lost 4 to 50 tons of carbon per hectare, depending on species. Now, this is in addition to any carbon that was removed in the course of harvest, but these are net emissions until uptake offsets those emissions. And these losses will not be offset until the trees reach approximately 19 to 40 years of age. So in other words, by the time they re-achieve carbon neutrality with the regeneration of the subsequent forest, at that time there's been a net loss of 4 to 50 tons of carbon, which will take a further decade or so to offset, so that it's only after, say, 20 to 40 years that you reach a stage where the carbon cost of the harvest, and again, not including the tree itself, but the carbon cost of the harvest, of the subsequent carbon emissions, has been made up by the regenerating forest. And at that point, you're back to zero, but that's only after about 20 to 40 years following the harvest event. Carbon uptake, only beyond this age is carbon uptake actually nets carbon sequestered by the stands. So it's only after this period of time that the forest becomes a net sink of carbon, until, of course, the next harvest. Now, we went in and we wanted to look at the actual CO2 fluxes to understand and to test our understanding of the processes that lead to the regeneration of carbon. There's a lot of dots and lines on this graph. I won't spend too long going into them. It is published in TELUS. But here we have the site that was harvested in 2000. Here the site, an earlier site harvested in 1988, and here an earlier one in 1949. So as we go from this column to this column to this column, we're looking at forests that are getting older and older, that have had a longer and longer period since stand replacement. We also have data from 2003, 4, 5, 6. So as we go down, we're seeing for each of those three sites on the chronosequence, we're seeing the increasing age. So in fact, if you follow these blue numbers here, you'll see the age of the forest, okay, increasing as we go from left to right and up to down. And what you can see generally is that the carbon cycle, this is for a selected period here in mid to late June. The carbon cycle is approximately neutral in the newly harvested sites. The carbon cycle gradually amplifies, particularly with uptake following the regeneration of the forest. And by the time it gets to be mature, you can see that, again, uptake substantially exceeds emissions. So although carbon emissions remain fairly stable or maybe increase slightly, represented by the negative values in these graphs, the carbon uptake increases substantially as you progress along the chronosequence. And eventually, it's these increases in CO2 uptake that offset the smaller increases in ecosystem respiration and lead to the recovery of sink capability on the part of the forest. Now, as we observe these fluxes, we notice that they are also very sensitive to changes in weather. Here's a cooling period here, warm weather going to cool weather, not too much of an effect on the younger part of the chronosequence, a slight effect here, but a very pronounced effect here. You notice with the warmer weather transitioning to the cooler, the uptake fluxes increase substantially, and the emissions here also decline somewhat. So you can see that there's a much greater sensitivity to changes in weather on the part of the mature forest than there is on the teenage, for the adolescent forest, if you like, and the juvenile forest, still at a very young stage. We also see this during warming events. It's really the reverse change. Here's a period of warming, again, fairly little effect on the young chronosequence, somewhat of an effect on the immediately aged forest, and a much stronger effect in the mature forest, showing that rises of a few degrees in temperature can have a very strong effect on net carbon uptake of these forests. So here we see an interaction of climate and disturbance on the net exchange of carbon by these forests. It's a little bit complex, but there's actually good reasons. As you see, we capture this same interaction in the model, and that's actually captured through an understanding of the hydraulics that water follows as it moves from the soil through roots up the stem and then out through the canopy into the atmosphere. We understand that those hydraulics become more adverse as the tree gets taller and larger. Okay, these are the same data, but now aggregated to a full annual scale, expressed on a daily basis at an annual scale. The main point I want to note is that as we progress through years and through time, and along the chronosequence, and again, the age is indicated by these blue numbers here, as we progress through the forest regeneration cycle, substituting space for time, as is said along the chronosequence, we see that the period of net carbon uptake increases with forest age. It's almost non-existent. This was this very brief period here that we simulated and studied in more detail. It was right around this period here. You can see the period of net carbon uptake is very brief for these younger forests as we go through here. It tends to lengthen for the intermediate-aged forest in its teenage years and becomes much longer for the forest in the as it progresses. So as those carbon fluxes recover with the regenerating leaf area and the regenerating nutrient cycle of the disturbed forest, we see more and more uptake and a greater duration of net carbon uptake in the older forest. We also, however, see very strong adverse effects of warming periods. You'll notice that each of the forests here, they have these very sharp downward spikes, which you can see is also captured by the model. And these spikes here are actually warming events. It's when the temperature goes up, daytime temperatures may be low to high 20s. If it gets above 30, that's kind of an extreme warming event for the West Coast. But these brief warming events have a very sudden and adverse effect, a very nonlinear effect, if you like, on net carbon exchange by the forest. As the temperature goes above through the mid-20s, the forest transitions from being a fairly strong sink to being a very large source. Now, this gives us some pause when we consider the consequences of climate change, during which such events may become more intense and more frequent, and clearly having a very strong sort of threshold-type effect on the productivity of these forests. And I'll come back to this point a little bit later. We can then aggregate these fluxes to an annual time scale to look at the decadal scale course of the recovery of the carbon cycle following a disturbance. Now here we've plotted our model results as the yellow line. The red symbols are the aggregated Eddy covariance measurements, and we see that prior to the disturbance at year 0, prior to the disturbance, we have a productivity of 250 to 300 grams carbon per meter squared. That's in the older forest. A sudden drop down to about 6 tons per hectare, 5 to 6 tons or 5 to 600 grams per meter squared of carbon net emissions. That recovers after about 15, closer to 20 years, becomes a very strong sink. From about 20 years to about 50 or 60 years, we have a number of values from that chronosequence that we showed earlier, which gives annual totals measured by these indicated by these red dots. There's a bunch here. Very strong fertilization effects here. Urea is broadcast at 20 grams N per meter squared. Very strong, although transient response to nitrogen application. And you can see, again, we don't have measurements to support this, but in the model, a very gradual decline of net ecosystem productivity as the forest ages, again due to changing nutrient status, changing carbon status, and changing water status associated with the growth of the tree. So it follows that time trend that I indicated on the very first diagram of results, showing that trend toward very much smaller productivity as the forest ages. Although, again, this forest still remains a fairly important carbon sink, according to our projections, even out well into its second century. I'll just come back very quickly before I move on. You notice the very large degree of interannual variability. You can see it in the measured results here as well. There's a lot of interannual variability in productivity, which is associated with changes in weather. And again, I want to come back to this point later. Here's another question that we get asked. How does fire affect the carbon balance of forests? Well, as it turns out, we had a couple of fire chronosequences in the network, one in Saskatchewan, one in Manitoba. Results were brought in from other ones in Alaska and Arizona. Those are actually outside the network, but brought in just to expand the range of the study. The 3 boreal chronosequences, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alaska, became net sinks after about 10 years. So for the first 10 years after the fire, they're fairly substantial carbon sources. However, from about 10 years onward, they remain carbon sinks of anywhere up to about 200 grams carbon per meter squared per year. That's 2 tons per hectare per year. NEPs for sites older than 10 years was generally stable, okay? So it didn't show this long-term decline that we showed in the earlier graph following fire. If we integrate the curve, if we were to fit a curve to these data here and just kind of fit a curve to this, and we integrated the area between the curve and a 0 net carbon neutrality, we would find that there's a net accumulation of about 15 tons of carbon per hectare after 30 years. If we went to, say, 30 years in this graph and integrated up to this point here, there'd be a positive value of about 15 tons of carbon per hectare. That would pretty much offset the carbon lost to fire, okay, at the fire event here, so that following a fire and the associated loss by combustion out to the atmosphere, as well as the subsequent loss through emission from coarse woody debris left behind by the fire, and also loss due to the slow regeneration of the forest following the fire. It would take actually about 30 years to offset that total loss. Only 30 years after the fire would the forest again become a net sink of carbon. This comes from some work put together by Brian Amiro and a bunch of colleagues out of University of Manitoba. Now, GPP clearly increases with stand age for the first 20 or 30 years, and then after that, it appears not to increase further. Ecosystem respiration had a less well-defined time course because, of course, ecosystem respiration is sourced from heterotrophic decomposition of coarse woody debris, but also by autotrophic decomposition of roots and other plant parts, so that it follows a less well-defined time course. What is interesting, however, is that these 3 points here and consequently up here appear to deviate from the time trend, and this is attributed to the fact that for this particular Saskatchewan chronosequence, a lot of snags were left standing after the fire, which only came to the ground after about 20 years and only then started to decompose. So a lot of the time course that we see here is going to be governed by the transitioning of snags to coarse woody debris and its subsequent decomposition. And the time course of that transition is not very well understood, but it will certainly in some key cases govern the time course of net carbon exchange by these fire-affected stands. The mountain pine beetle has been a really big issue, of course, in BC and to some extent here in Alberta. What is the impact of insect attacks on forest carbon balances? There were 2 sites at which towers were mounted as part of our network. One was an 85-year-old lodgepole pine site, first attacked in 2006. In 2010, at the end of measurements, only about 16% of the trees remained healthy. A second site was also established, a 110-year-old lodgepole pine stand with an understory, first attacked 3 years earlier in 2003. By the time the measurement started in 2007, there was almost complete pine canopy mortality. CO2 fluxes measured over a period of 4 years were from 2008. Actually, I'm sure that should be 2010 at the bottom. Okay. Over a period of 4 years were aggregated. And now for the 06 disturbed site, a measurement started the next year indicating a substantial source. This source declined and actually became a sink over the 2 following years, indicating that there was a fairly rapid recovery, certainly in terms of sink capacity, from the insect attack on this 85-year-old site. Now, for the site that was attacked in 2003, it was almost completely dead. It was greater than 95% dead by the time measurements started in 2007. Again, a substantial sink of 0.6 tons of carbon per hectare for 06, approximately carbon neutral the following 2 years, but then back to a source again. Sorry, these are sources. A source again of 0.3 in 2000, and this should be 2010. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but 2010. So this much more adversely affected stand appeared to remain a carbon source, or at best carbon neutral for the duration of the study. What were inferences that were drawn? The surviving trees and vegetation appeared to benefit. Those trees that did survive benefited from reduction of competition for nutrients in soil water and an increase in solar radiation that reached the lower levels of the canopy and understory. And this benefit, to some extent, offset the direct losses due to the death of the trees. There was also, certainly at this site at least, there was a substantial resurgence of the understory. Pioneer vegetation. So it's not lodgepole pine, but it's fixing carbon nonetheless. There was a sudden rapid resurgence of the understory once dominance was released by the mountain pine beetle attack. However, we should note it takes many years for the dead trees to fall and then to start decomposing, which, as I mentioned, for the fire will affect the long-term time course of net carbon exchange, so that these dead trees, although they're still standing, they represent a carbon liability, which will eventually have to be cleared when looking at the total effect of the mountain pine beetle on forest carbon stocks in Canada. Because those trees, once they're dead, they don't come back. Moving on to peatlands. Canada's peatlands, gaining or losing carbon. This is a big question because huge amounts of carbon are stored in peatlands. As a matter of fact, in peatlands globally, there's more carbon stored in peatlands than there is in all the above-ground vegetation around the world. So peatlands are an extremely important reservoir of carbon, and perhaps nowhere more so than in Canada, where there's such a vast extent of peatlands. One of the questions that's being asked is, are peatlands currently gaining or losing carbon? There are two peatlands, as I mentioned earlier in our study. The western peatland, located near Lac La Biche. It's a treed fen with a dense cover. It's not acidic. It's a pH of about 6.4, so it's, well, at very best less acidic. The water table is still relatively close to the surface, although we note that, in fact, possibly due to a change in regional hydrology, the water table at this site is progressively declining. It's getting lower and lower. For reasons perhaps not yet fully understood. But the water table remains fairly close to the surface, but it is declining. Water does move laterally through the site, transporting nutrients at rates about which we're not quite sure. And it's estimated that it sequestered about 11.3 tons of carbon for the period of measurement from 2004 to 2009. So over that period of time, there's been a net uptake of 11.3 tons of carbon per hectare, indicating that it's a fairly strong sink. We also have the eastern peatland located near Ottawa. This, by contrast, is an ombrotrophic bog covered with moss and shrubs. It is more acidic. pH is around 4 somewhere. That's got a lot to do with the sphagnum moss with which it's covered. It has a comparatively deep water table and receives rainfall only, nutrients from the atmosphere above it only. It sequestered a much lower amount from 2004 to 2009, a much lower amount of carbon than did the less acidic fen in Alberta. Even that figure, I think, is somewhat high from what I've seen of data recorded before 2004 at the site. The rate of carbon sequestration is actually less than that figure indicated, but maybe it may be recovering due to the weather that it experienced during that period. All right, let's look at some work we're doing at the site. We'll contrast 2005 with 2008. 2005, the water table is comparatively high. 2008, the water table has gone down. So the question that we're asking ourselves here is the decline in water table that's being observed at this site, can it be understood in terms of inputs and outputs, both vertical and lateral, through this landscape? And what are the consequences of this decline on net carbon exchange of this ecosystem? So that although this peatland is a fairly strong sink, will it remain so as this decline in the water table continues, if in fact it continues? We have up here the net ecosystem productivity. The dots here are values aggregated from the Eddy covariance measurements that I discussed earlier for 2005 and 2008. The lines are model results that we generate from the model that we use in our lab. This is done by a PhD candidate, Simon Mesbahadin, who's in the audience today. This is his work as part of his PhD thesis. What we see here is that although we can understand the declining water table represented by the model lines here in terms of the site hydrology, the consequence for carbon exchange is such that there tends to be greater CO2. There tends to be both greater CO2 uptake and greater CO2 emissions as water table continues to decline in this peatland. So although there appears to be maybe a greater net carbon uptake, in fact, that net carbon uptake is largely offset by greater carbon emissions, partly during the off-season, as you can see here, and during the year. We'll zoom in on a couple of days in 2005 and 2008 and see if we can get a closer idea as to how this decline in water table from about 30 centimeters here to about 50 centimeters here, how that decline in water table has affected surface carbon exchange in this peatland. Here we see values again. The values that are indicated here are values directly measured by Eddy covariance. The squares here, the lines here are the model results from a long-term spin-up run and taken out for a selected period of time during a part of a year. And you can see here that there has been an increase in the emission of CO2. Negative values at night indicate ecosystem respiration. Of course, there's no fixation during that period of time. So the fact that you get greater negative values at night with the lower water table indicate that emission has increased with the lowering of the water table. Now, in the model, The deeper water table improves oxygenation of the zone above the water table. The greater energy yield of oxidation reduction reactions associated with the reduction of oxygen hastens soil respiration. It also hastens mineralization and hence nutrient uptake and consequently CO2 fixation, which at least to some extent offsets the effect of increased oxidation of the soil on respiration. So we see here an increase in respiration brought about by hastening of the microbial oxidation reduction reactions. That is largely offset, pretty much completely offset by increased CO2 fluxes, increased uptake of CO2 in response to the hastened mineralization and nutrient uptake that occurs when the water table is lowered. Now, to the extent, now how low can the water table go before we start to see other effects come in? That's a big question, which unfortunately we're not going to be able to answer because the project terminated in 2010 and we don't have any further results. And the station has since been dismantled. So far so good. What about the eastern peatland? What we found in examining the results from the eastern peatland is that carbon sequestration in this peatland is much more sensitive to water table depth, to changes in the water table depth associated with changes in rainfall and temperature, consequently the changes in the surface water balance. We see here 2 years. Now, this work was done by Dmitry Dimitrov as part of his PhD thesis while he was here. He's since graduated. But what we found at this site is that deeper water tables cause loss of carbon sequestration during a drier year, 2001. 2001 was a comparatively warm and dry year in Ottawa, in contrast to 2004, which was cooler and wetter. And what you can see here in the CO2 fluxes, the 2001 has much lower uptake. It may have comparable or slightly reduced respiration, but much, much lower uptake in 2001. You can see here in this synthesized or sort of aggregated diurnal profile of CO2 fluxes over this entire period. It emerges more clearly. There's been a substantial reduction in carbon uptake, and if we express that as daily totals, again, you can see the substantial reduction. Now, the symbols here again are Eddy covariance measurements at the site. The lines there represent the model results. The model attributed this reduction to a drying of the moss surface. Moss is a key component of ecosystem carbon fluxes in this site. It is, however, very shallowly rooted because of its small stature and hence very vulnerable to surface drying once the water table drops below a certain point. Now, the water table at Mare Bleue tends to be lower than that at the western peatland, leastways up to the present time. So what we're seeing is the effect of an even further decline in the water table than what we've measured yet so far at the western peatland, associated with a vegetation which has a very shallow rooting profile, and the combination of those two developments has led to this very sharp loss in productivity. We see here expressed on an annual time scale, the very sharp productivity. In 2001, this sharp drop resulted in the peatland being almost carbon neutral, whereas in 2004, the wetter year, it had recovered and become a fairly substantial carbon sink. Here, approximately carbon neutral, about a zero net carbon exchange on an annual basis. These units here are grams of carbon per meter squared, but recovering to about 100, close to 100 grams carbon per meter squared in 2004, with the recovery of the carbon cycle brought about by the rehydration of the moss that was in turn caused by the rising water table that allowed that rehydration to occur. So this is the climatic response of this ecosystem is very different from that of the western peatland, and its productivity is much lower and again more vulnerable to interannual variability in weather. So again, we see the recovery here of the carbon of the annual totals. Another big question that comes up is, do methane emissions offset carbon sequestration in northern peatlands? Now, again, this is more work done by Larry Flanagan, who's the PI at this site, and this is the data we have from him so far. I believe more is on its way, but this is what we've got at the moment. We do know that western peatlands in northern latitudes have been estimated to release between 6 and 40 million tons of methane per year. The magnitude of these emissions can have a significant effect on the total carbon budget, particularly with respect to the greenhouse gas warming potential. Recalling that a molecule of methane has about 21 to 25 times the global warming potential of one of CO2, fairly small emissions of methane can offset fairly large sequestrations of carbon in determining the greenhouse gas balance of a peatland. What do we know so far? We only have one set of measurements so far. I believe more will become available, but so far we have methane emission measured at the western peatland of about 0.024 tons of carbon per hectare. If these were to be expressed in their CO2 equivalent units for global warming potential, would offset about 25% of the carbon sequestration that occurred during the growing season in 2007. Now, we need to, that's not a very long time scale on which to base general conclusions. We need to substantiate these findings with further data that I think is, as I say, being generated. For the eastern peatlands, however, average methane emissions at the eastern peatlands are somewhere in the range of 0.037 tons of carbon per hectare per year, or about 3.7 grams of methane per meter squared per year. And these emissions pretty much entirely offset the much lower carbon sequestration that occurs at this site. Now, it should be noted that in a drier year, and 2007 was a drier year with a lower water table, this offsetting may be less than would be the case if the water table were higher. Methane emission is very sensitive to the elevation of the water table, so that these values here are very subject to interannual variability associated with that of the depth of the water table. But as a general observation, methane emissions at the eastern peatland pretty much offset any carbon sequestration that occurs at that site. When you apply about a 21 multiplier to that value to express its value in CO2 equivalents, again, when expressed in common units of carbon, A big question that comes up is, how does year-to-year variability affect the productivity of Canada's forests? The reason why this is important is because when we project changes in global temperatures of maybe 3 degrees over the next century, much of that change that we're predicting is already present within the climate record that we have. Let me give an example. For an aspen site in central Saskatchewan, 2006 was a comparatively warm year. 2004 was a cool year. The difference in annual temperature between the 2 years was actually about 2 degrees, or a fairly substantial part of the warming that we're predicting over the next century. These are the daily average temperatures plotted here. Over here, we've plotted the time course of cumulative NEP for those 2 years. So in 2004, the ecosystem remained a sink until, a net source of productivity until about late June, at which time carbon neutrality was reached. After that, cumulative NEP increased, but the ecosystem ended up the year being about carbon neutral. Now, the solid line here represents the model calculation. The dotted line here represents the cumulative NEP, again from the Eddy covariance measurements. In 2006, however, although there was greater respiration with the warmer soil in winter, there was a much larger accumulation in the summer, such that by the end of the year, there was a gain of about 3 tons of carbon per hectare in 2006 versus 2004, indicating that these aspen forests respond very strongly to soil warming. And this is attributed both to the positive effect of higher temperatures on CO2 fixation in a broadleaf deciduous plant functional type, also to hasten mineralization in warmer soils that enables more rapid nutrient uptake. If we look at the same thing for droughts, however, in 2001 was the first year of the great drought that lasted from 01 to 03 through much of central Alberta and Saskatchewan. During 2001, however, there was enough water carried over from previous rainy years that the drought was not actually experienced by the forest. In 2003, on the other hand, that was the third year of the drought, and soils in the same aspen stand were starting to become fairly dry, as indicated by TDR measurements in the dots and by model calculations in the solid lines. You can see the earlier and deeper drying in 2003 versus 2001. This had a very adverse effect on carbon accumulation, which essentially ceased after the end of July in 2003, although it continued on pretty much to late September in 2001, resulting in a net loss of about 2 tons of carbon per hectare attributed to the third year of the drought. So again, aspen forests respond very adversely to soil drawing brought about by about 3 years of subnormal precipitation. It was about 50 to 60% long-term averages. So there's a very strong drought effect. This effect of interannual variability in temperature, however, is exactly the opposite if we look at temperate conifers on the west coast. Here we're out at the BC site. 1999 was a cool La Nina year. 2004 was a warmer El Nino year. There was a big forest fires actually all up the west coast in 2004. You can see the temperature difference here. The annual average temperature is higher by about 1.5 degrees or so in 2004 versus 1999. And again, you see the accumulation of NEP over the course, much larger values in this more productive temperate conifer. The main difference to note, however, is the difference between the blue and the red line suggests that this warming in 2004 caused a drop of about 2 tons of carbon per hectare in the net carbon uptake of this coniferous forest. And that can be traced back to those very sharp spikes in net ecosystem productivity that I talked about earlier that are associated with rises in temperature of above about 20 to 25 degrees Celsius in the daytime. So this is a little bit disturbing because it does suggest that these forests will respond adversely to warming temperatures. But that we can explain this adverse response, again, in terms of basic tree, the biological response of trees to changing temperature and water status of the atmosphere and the soils in which it's functioning. We can aggregate these findings to a continental scale and look at the effect of these changes in weather on forests at different places across the continent. As we go in this diagram from left to right and down through succeeding rows, we're moving from west to east across the continent. There are a number of events that occurred during these years. There was an El Nino-La Nina event. There was the drought in 98-99. There was the drought year, 2001 to 2003. And there was actually a period of warming, certainly in the central part of the continent, in 2004 to 2006. And I've referred to site-specific effects of these three climatic events in the earlier slide. If we look at how this plays out across the continent, the El Nino-La Nina event had very different effects on the productivity of the BC Douglas fir that you see here versus the aspen. I guess I should be using the pointer. The BC Douglas fir here and the aspen fir had very differing responses to the the cooling associated with the transition from El Nino to La Nina in 88 to 89. Very different responses associated with those changes in temperature. During the drought year, you can see the negative effect going from 01 to 02 and to 03 in the old aspen. You can see the 01 to 02 drought effect in the black spruce and the jack pine. However, 2003 was actually fairly productive for the black spruce stands and to some extent for the jack pine stand, indicating that coniferous forests respond very differently to interannual variability in weather than do deciduous forests such as aspen. And again, this is associated with the much lower transpiration rates in coniferous forests that effectively conserve water and make these forests less vulnerable to transient changes in precipitation. And then finally, the warming period that you see through here had positive effects at a number of continental sites in Saskatchewan and in Manitoba. There was an effect of warming brought about during those years. However, that warming was not so apparent in the balsam fir on the east coast, and again, that's a coniferous plant operating at warmer temperatures that appears to have experienced an adverse effect. However, we have a very limited data record from this site, so it's difficult to draw confident inferences from this site. As we aggregate our model runs longer and longer, we can test them against forest inventory data, which we have here for a number of the sites in the study. Inventory measurements were taken. We see distinct growth rates. We see fairly rapid growth rates of temperate conifers on the west coast and the east coast, which we're able to capture. We see intermediate rates of wood accumulation in the continental or the boreal aspen, and then much lower rates in the boreal conifers. And all of these we can capture with a basic understanding of the tree biology and the soil characteristics on which those trees are growing. But this is important when we want to aggregate and look at national forest carbon stocks. We also use these models then to project climate change. I'll just step through these quickly. We have a couple of climate change scenarios here. The black line represents current rates of wood accumulation. The red and the blue lines represent rates in response to different climate change scenarios over the course of the next century for forests that are harvested in 2010 and regrown for the rest of the century, or old growth forests that are harvested in 25 and then regrown. You see most of the divergence in the lines indicating a positive effect of climate change occurs later in the century. Here, of course, we have the effects of rising CO2 as well as temperature. We have the aspen in Saskatchewan, again, positive effect, jack pine and black spruce. So these are just projections we're making. The purpose of these projections is to bring an accounting of climate change into the National Forest Carbon Inventory when models are used, inventory models are used to make these projections for the next century. And that's an ongoing project. Now, we can aggregate these fluxes up to a continental scale. We can use fairly simple but process-based models using gridded data sets of forest type, leaf area index, forest stand age, etc. This model, these results were sent to us by Jing Chen, University of Toronto, and shows for the forested areas of North America. It shows carbon sources and sinks indicated by the color diagram down here in 2000. Now, this flux field here is pegged, or it's forced to agree with NDP generated at 37 flux tower sites around the continent to try to tie its value down. That just shows the range here. You see the smaller values for the north, the very large values for the southeast, and the Carolinian forests along the in southern Ontario and the eastern states. The high values along the west coast, and again, the lower values for the boreal forest in the middle. We also have values from tall towers. Tall towers are also part of the network. These sample CO2 concentrations and infer their sources from backward calculations of trajectories of carbon in packets of air, and infer sources for different parts of the continent. I won't go into these in detail. It's another part of the network. But the 3 tower sites built as part of the Canada Carbon Program, these are examples of spatially averaged or temporally average but spatially variable carbon concentrations estimated over different parts of the continent from wind patterns, and detailed measurements of CO2 concentrations at tall towers located here at East Trout Lake, Lac La Biche, and Chibougamau. These graphics didn't come through very clearly, but again, they just show these carbon towers. These results are used to infer continental sources and sinks, which are indicated here. These are very regional in nature because of the large scale of the towers. But this forms a very important top-down constraint on our estimates of carbon sources and sinks as inferred from large-scale atmospheric readings. We're doing some of this work now in our own lab. Our ecosystem model, ecosys, is now scaled up. This is an example of some work done by Zelalem Makonnen, who's a grad student in my lab. Here we have the LAI model for January 2010 for all of North America on a grid scale of 0.25 degrees resolution. This uses North American regional reanalysis weather data from 1979 to 2010. There are land cover type maps and soil databases, all of which are used to provide input conditions under which the model is run for a 200-year spin-up, at the end of which in January 2010, LAI here is mapped out. Fairly low values over most of the continent, representing either the Arctic landscape or the deciduous forest further south. Higher values for the boreal forest. The same map, but in July 2010, again showing the greening up of many parts of certainly of the southeast, the deciduous forest. The very high LAIs of along the west coast, the higher LAIs in the boreal forest, and small rises in the Arctic tundra. These can be tested against, I'm just about done. These can be tested against, he did actually give me a little, let me see if I can get this to work. No, hang on. All right, we'll have to miss that, unfortunately. Zelalem did give me a little animation showing the monthly time course. I'm getting a little late on time, so I'm going to move on. These LAIs can be tested against MODIS measurements of AVHR, MODIS measurements of NDVI, so we do actually have a ground truth against which we can compare the spatial patterns of LAI that we model. Here we have the GPP for the entire continent, showing the very small values in the north, graduating to the much larger values on the west coast and the southeastern U.S., intermediate values in the Carolinian forests of southern Ontario and the east. We're also doing work in which we are doing regional analysis, regional studies of vegetation type, soil type, and disturbance patterns to see if we can bring in here a treatment of interannual variability in weather that we can build into the Canadian, the the carbon budget model of the Canadian Forest Service to try to bring some kind of climatic sensitivity into this, so that the forest inventory calculations made using the CFS CBM model can be made sensitive to the interannual variability in weather that the process models are able to some extent to represent, as we discussed earlier. I'll skip over the next point in the interest of time. We're also working with the Canadian Climate Centre for modeling and analysis to develop or help them develop their land surface boundary, the Canadian terrestrial ecosystem model. This is the land surface boundary for the Canadian Climate Centre's GCM, which is used for global climate change projections, the land surface of which is a critical component. We're also working to develop that. This is an example sent to me by Vivek Arora, their modeler down there, of this is NPP generated globally for a rather large grid cell, generated globally, which represents, in a sense, the flux field that their land surface model generates. And again, we work with them to try to develop the algorithms that can be used for this application. So in a concluding statement, what have we found out with all this? We've been able to combine our data with data from other similar measurements. There are actually flux networks, of course, in the States, throughout Europe, Australia. There's an emerging network in Africa. There's a fairly well-developed flux network in Asia, with whom we also work. We've been able to combine these fluxes with those from other similar measurement networks across the world to establish a global database that can be used for analysis of carbon cycles of vastly different ecosystems. We have an archived data set that is publicly available and that will continue to remain available for a long period of time. We've got a legacy, of course, of 120 graduates and postdocs who have trained with us over the years, and will carry the mandate into the future. And finally, of course, then there's been about 200 peer-reviewed articles, as well as a special issue of agricultural and forest meteorology that have also come out of this project. So with a brief acknowledgement to our funders, who were munificent, I'll conclude my presentation.